I know you're wanting to listen to this episode of the Comics Alternative, but before we get started, let me just remind you guys that it's the gift-giving season. Now, that may be obvious, but one of the things that's not so obvious is that you can get all of your stuff and help out the podcast by going to comicsalternative.com/Amazon. Click through on our Amazon banner that you find on that page, and whatever you get during that visit to Amazon, the Comics Alternative will get a few cents kickback. So, whether it be Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, or Festivus, get your gifts through our Amazon Associate link. It's a smart way to get your books, and you'll be helping out the podcast. And isn't that what the holiday season is all about? Helping our podcast. This is the Comics Alternative Manga. Reviews of Sailor Moon Eternal Edition, Volumes 1 and 2, and Mob Psycho 100, Volume 1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two comic scholars who like to talk about manga. And on this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga series, we're going to be looking at two recent titles. We're going to begin with Naoko Takeuchi's Sailor Moon Eternal Editions, the first two volumes. And then after that, we're going to take a gander at Mob Psycho 100 by 1. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by those great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
And if you're looking for manga, you can get volumes of Rurouni Kenshin for 30% off, and you can get books like Akira, which we've talked about on the show, for 25% off.
Yeah, you know, you really can't beat the great discounts at Discount Comic Book Service. It's just an incredible place to get your manga. We highly recommend that you check them out. So go to dcbservice.com because they will take care of all of your comics and manga pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. Well, Shea, this is, I guess, technically our November show, even though it's coming out at the beginning of December. And, you know, this is not unusual for us. It seems like about, I don't know, every other or every third month we're a little late. I know that this has been kind of a rough month for both of us. We unfortunately weren't able to do the October kind of horror manga show that we had planned on doing because of things going on with me, my father having died in October, and that really preoccupied me. And then in terms of November, I know that you, being in grad school, have and teaching as well, have all of these end of the semester obligations. And I remember what that's about.
Yeah, it's you know, it's just a time when I'm having to grade, 15, 20 papers and get those last grades in. So it's a little bit of a crunch, but we managed to finally get some time to talk.
Yeah. And, the important thing is that we're back with the manga show. And even though this is a late November episode, we do plan on recording, I hope on time, a December show. So this may be another occasion where our listeners and fans of the manga series will get a double shot.
And this time we mean it.
So the first title that Shea and I are going to be discussing on this late November show is Sailor Moon Eternal Editions. And Sailor Moon is by Naoko Takeuchi. And this is coming out from Kodansha. Now, in, I guess, around early September, Kodansha came out with the first volume in these really nice Eternal Editions of Sailor Moon. And then the second volume was released just last month in mid-November. And from my understanding, one of the things that makes these Eternal Editions stand out outside of, I guess, the presentation and the packaging, because it's really nice paper. You have the French flap covers. It's rather oversized, right? So you don't have, what you see with a lot of manga, the kind of small, almost digest size, which I really appreciate. But in addition to that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Shea, but I think that these are new translations.
I actually am not sure about that. This is Sailor Moon is one of those series that's it's incredibly popular. And so I've never been one to do a very good job of keeping up with the translations of these mammoth series like Naruto or One Piece. As opposed to some of the smaller titles we cover on here, where I'm like, I'm picking that book up because I know Ryan Holmberg translated it. For stuff like this, I'm completely in the dark about stuff like that. I
think I did read somewhere, and it could have been on the Kodansha side, I'm not sure, that these are new translations. Now, the translator of these volumes, Alethea Nibley and Athena Nibley. I'm assuming that they're related. But and maybe I'm wrong there, but I do think that I saw somewhere that these are new translations. Now, as you said, Sailor Moon is an incredibly popular manga series. And I'd heard about it, for years and years and years. And it's something that I know that my daughter read some of. I don't think she read the entire series. Maybe she did. Who knows? Do you have any experience with Sailor Moon before, let's say, now?
I would say my experience is pretty similar to yours. Obviously, living through the 90s, especially growing up in the 90s and, watching Toonami on Cartoon Network very frequently. It was something I kind of had, caught, brief snippets of the anime. So I had a sort of vague awareness of kind of what the plot entailed. And I knew it was very popular. I knew it was a kind of shojo series, and so I could kind of guess that it would feature certain elements that I knew were common in shojo manga. But outside of that, I would say I the only thing I could really tell anyone about it was that it's very popular. Was basically all I really knew about it. So this was kind of it was an interesting experience to kind of finally get to read this.
Yeah. I have to admit that I was a little prejudiced against Sailor Moon in the past because I didn't know what it was about. And maybe I guess I was rather closed-minded about that. But I guess I got this because my daughter really liked it. And I know that she told me that some of her friends her own age liked the series as well. I knew it was shoujo, but I thought that there was something about it that just seemed a little more juvenile. And again, because of what my daughter would tell me. And she had me or asked me to read some of the manga that she had been reading and when she was, much younger, was excited about, like Fruits Basket, right? So I read the first volume of Fruits Basket and thought, okay, fine. And so I don't know. I just thought that things like Sailor Moon and what is another title that she was really into? I think Black Butler was another one. I just thought, I don't know if this would be for me. And, we've discussed quite a bit of shoujo on the manga series. And so I wasn't prejudiced against it being a kind of shoujo manga. I don't know. I had misconceptions about what Sailor Moon was about. So when I saw that Kodansha was going to be putting out these really nice Eternal Editions, I thought this would be a perfect opportunity for me to try Sailor Moon to see what it's about and for us to, discuss on the manga series. And I'm glad I did. And I have to say that I mean, maybe there's some issues that I have with Sailor Moon. I have enjoyed it, at least these first 2 volumes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say that my experience was pretty similar. Like I said, kind of before reading this, all I really knew about Sailor Moon was that it was very popular. But as maybe some of the listeners of the show will know, we met each other when I was working at a comic book store, and during my time there, I think this was the last time Kodansha put out a new edition of this. They were, the kind of the tankobon format, the format that you were kind of talking about, that manga is typically kind of published in, and seeing the covers of those, I'm not entirely sure, what qualities of those covers really kind of put me off on the idea of really reading Sailor Moon, but they did give me the idea that it would be it wouldn't be the sort of thing that I would get a lot out of. It seemed to be a series with kind of simplistic or simpler art that I didn't really feel would move me. But like you, when I actually sat down to read this, I was kind of bowled over by the fact that I did find myself really, really enjoying it, and all of those kind of like you said, kind of prejudices that I had regarding kind of what the art might look like, or how the story might unfold, I think were completely wrong, and I was pleasantly surprised to be wrong.
Yeah, I was too, and in fact, I had no clue that Sailor Moon had this, I don't know if you'd call it sci-fi-ish, much more fantastical, I guess, edge to it. For some reason, I thought it was more about romance, and it does concern romance. Okay. I mean, that's definitely a part of the story, especially as we get into this second volume of the Eternal Edition. But I didn't know that Sailor Moon was about what it actually is about. And let's talk about that. I guess the plot, or at least the premise of what's going on in Sailor Moon. There's a lot, and at times it gets a little convoluted, with some characters going by 2 names, even 3. So at the very beginning, we're introduced to Usagi Tsukino, and she is a young girl. She is in middle school, right? She's 14, I think. And, she seems to be someone who is a so-so student. She's not brilliant. She's someone who is often late and maybe a little inept at certain things. And in fact, I think the first scene is her being late for school. And as she's rushing to school, she steps on a cat, which is kind of, it's kind of weird because, I think, a human, even a 14-year-old human with, the weight, stepping on a cat would kill it, or at least mortally wound it. But the cat survives, and she doesn't think much about it after that initial encounter. But then the cat shows up at her school later on. And then over time, she learns that this cat's name is actually Luna, and the cat can talk to her. And Luna begins talking with Usagi about a kind of power that she has and kind of a hidden identity that has been dormant for a while. And so that's how she eventually comes to realize that she has certain powers and goes by the name of Sailor Moon, thus the title of the series. And then, at least in this first volume, I think most of it is devoted to her rounding up her crew, so to speak. And so with the help of Luna, the cat, the talking cat, who we learn is from the moon, and in fact, Luna has a crescent moon on her forehead, the 2 of them go and find the other dormant identities that apparently had been partners or companions of Sailor Moon in the past. And we don't know what this past is, especially in the first volume. This is explained much more in the second volume of the Eternal Edition. But they gather other people around. So first they go to a young girl also in middle school by the name of Mamoru Chiba. Oh, no, I'm sorry, Ami Mizuno. So they awaken the powers within her. She goes by the name of Sailor Mercury. Then they find a woman, and one of the things that defines Ami is she is extremely smart.
Mm-hmm.
And then they find someone who seems to be rather, let me see. Oh, there's something quite graceful about her. I mean, she's beautiful. Rei Hino. And then they awaken the dormant identity in her. She goes by the name of Sailor Mars, and so she has powers as well. And each of these sailors, so to speak, have certain powers, right? So Sailor Moon is the guardian of love and what else? Love and justice. Love and justice. Yeah. And so each of the, certain sailors, like Sailor Mercury has certain powers, Sailor Mars has certain powers. Then they go to their third companion in addition to Usagi, and that is Makoto Kino, and I think she is bigger and stronger than the others. She goes by the name of Sailor Jupiter, and she has other powers. And then I think it's in the second volume that they get the final member of their team, and this is someone that we were introduced to in the first volume, and this is where things get a little confusing. There is, I guess, a crime fighter that is mentioned in the newspapers every now and again, that everyone calls Sailor V. And so with all these sailors, we learned about Sailor V, I think, before Usagi realizes that she's Sailor Moon. And so it's all these sailors. It's like, well, what's going on with the sailor thing? But we don't find out much about Sailor V until the second volume, and we learn that Sailor V is actually another one of their companions, and Sailor V, understandably so, goes by the name of Sailor Venus. Okay, so we have the moon and planets that distinguish these various sailors, these compatriots. So basically you have the team together with this first volume, but we're also in the first volume introduced to another very important character whose name is Mamoru Chiba, but he's also, I guess, maybe, we don't know for certain, kind of a crime fighter. We know that he's after the same thing that Sailor Moon and her companions are after, which is this thing called the mystical silver crystal. And in the first volume, this is repeated, mystical silver crystal, over and over and over again. And we don't know what the hell it is, right? It's never explained. But Mamoru is also after this, but he also goes out into the night in costume, and he wears a tuxedo and a mask, and so Usagi and the others call him Tuxedo Mask. Okay, that's imaginative. And so, there are run-ins with this, I guess what's called the Dark Kingdom, right? Mm-hmm. The big bads in this series. So we see Queen Beryl and then some of her henchmen, and we don't know much about these henchmen, although I think in the second volume of the Eternal Edition, we learned that they used to be footmen, or at least soldiers of someone by the name of Prince Endymion. And we'll come back to him in a second, because it gets even more confusing in the second volume. Don't you think?
No, I think...
more convoluted, more story elements stacked one on top of the other.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Reading it, I mean, I think a couple of the titles we've looked at on previous episodes, that are titles that were published after Sailor Moon, but definitely have the same sort of, I think, thinking about those helped me in my reading of this. And I'm thinking specifically of Moto Hagio's Otherworld Barbara and Revolutionary Girl Utena. And when we talked about Revolutionary Girl Utena, which is itself this very complicated like romance, action, magical girl story, we mentioned that it kind of came out of the making of the Sailor Moon anime, and I think reading the Sailor Moon manga, the kind of relationship between those two things is pretty clear. It's the same sort of it's the same sorts of kind of preoccupations with like past lives and like sort of divine otherworldly realms and things like that. But yeah, I think the kind of merit of something like Revolutionary Girl Utena or Otherworld Barbara, which does similar things, and Hagio, I think, is obviously an influence on Takeuchi. I think there is much more here in this series than in those other series, because those other series are shorter and they're kind of self-contained, whereas Sailor Moon is a little longer. And so as it goes on, you're right, it's not only like this big revelation, but it's like a series of cascading revelations and discoveries and additions of complexity that I would agree that does at times make it a bit of a, you've kind of got to remind yourself to keep, like, this person is this person who is also this person in another life. You've kind of always got to be making those sort of conscious reminders to yourself to keep things straight.
Yeah. And, we don't want to give away any spoilers. Yeah, we're not into spoilers on the Comics Alternative. There have been maybe a couple of occasions where we've accidentally kind of spilled some beans, so to speak. But I don't think it would be a spoiler to give out some of these other identities that you were alluding to. Because, in the second volume, as I said, it seems like we're getting more story layer elements piled one on top of the other, and things get rather narratively thick, if you want to put it that way. Because in the second volume, we're introduced to, I guess, the backstory of the Moon Kingdom. I think it's called the Moon Kingdom, which Sailor Moon and the rest, Sailor Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, were all a part of. And they had a kingdom on the moon, and then there was a kingdom on the earth. And the kingdom on the earth had, I guess, a prince by the name of Endymion. I guess that's how you pronounce his name. And the kingdom on the moon had both a queen called Queen Serenity, and there was a princess named Princess Serenity. And Princess Serenity had a thing for Prince Endymion. And they had a relationship, but apparently at the time, moon folk and earth folk were strictly forbidden from intermingling like that. But there was this dark force, again, the Dark Kingdom, that came and kind of screwed everything up on both the earth and the moon. And the way that at least the Moon Kingdom dealt with that matter at the time, I think they eventually defeated the leader of the Dark Kingdom, and this individual is called Queen Metaria. I guess that's how you pronounce her name. And they sealed her up, and that's how they describe it. We don't know what they sealed her in. We don't know the process, but apparently they didn't seal her that well, because by the time that we get to the beginning of, let's say, Volume 1, the Sailor Moon series, apparently Queen Metaria has been unsealed somehow. And so she's causing havoc again, thus why the Moon Kingdom, via Luna and another talking cat named Artemis, are getting the band back together, so to speak, right? And in fact, that first volume, you can describe it as a getting the band back together event, where they get, or reawaken, as they put it, the various soldiers who are the sailor soldiers who were part of the Moon Kingdom. Because the dark power has broken out again.
Yes, it has a very similar, I think, the kind of premise of a like the team, and then this like evil that's been like uncovered. It's very reminiscent of the setup for like Power Rangers and stuff like that. So listeners who are kind of familiar with the setup of that, particularly like the first couple seasons, I was reminded pretty strikingly of the ways in which that show, or at least what I remember of it from my childhood, the parallels between them were pretty striking to me. So yeah, it's it's interesting in the context of we've been talking about it as a kind of shojo series, but it also works as a kind of superhero story as well, in an interesting way, I thought.
That's good. I hadn't thought in those terms, but you're right. I mean, there's something superhero-ish about this series, at least what we've read of it so far. Other revelations that we get in this second volume, and again, I don't think this is spoiler because there are hints about this, I think, perhaps earlier on. And this gets to where these identities are not just doubling up, but tripling up. Mm-hmm. So we learn that, the aforementioned Princess Serenity is actually Usagi Tsukino, or that Usagi Tsukino is actually Princess Serenity. Mm-hmm. So she's Usagi, she's Sailor Moon, she's also Princess Serenity. And we learn that Mamoru, who is Tuxedo Mask, is actually Prince Endymion. So he's Mamoru, Tuxedo Mask, and Endymion. And I expect in future volumes to come, there's going to be maybe a fourth identity that comes up, right? And they're going to be awakened to that. So you have all these past lives. But yeah, and we also in the second volume learn a bit more about the Dark Kingdom and Queen Beryl, and especially Queen Metaria and what they have going on. And we learn more about what the hell the mystical silver crystal is all about, because we actually see it. Mm-hmm. But apparently, I guess some power from the crystal is transferred into Mamoru / Tuxedo Mask / Endymion, and then he is taken by Queen Beryl and the turncoat soldiers. And these soldiers used to work for Endymion, but then they went to the dark side, so to speak, to work for the Dark Kingdom. But anyway, he is in their clutches, and they're trying to get the power from the crystal, but they also want to try to get the crystal itself. And Sailor Moon, or Usagi, or Princess Serenity, whatever the hell you want to call her, or you choose to call her, has the crystal. But there's something absent from the crystal, and she suspects that whatever power or essence was in the mystical silver crystal is now inside of Endymion. / Tuxedo Max / Mamoru.
Yeah, hearing you talk or try and detail the kind of workings of this plot, I'm struck by the fact that, like I said, kind of my experience with Sailor Moon was kind of catching glimpses of it or ads for it or being aware that it was running on Toonami, and I think for me, I've always kind of come to associate Sailor Moon with the 90s. I tend to think of it as a kind of particularly 90s thing. And I kind of get the sense that that's true for a lot of people, but hearing you kind of detail the plot back, I am struck by how kind of typical it is for manga and anime from the 90s, the premise of a kind of lost royalty, being awakened to their true nature by like aliens, and then having to go off and explore their magic powers and things like that. It's something I've seen at least several times in kind of pretty popular stuff. So it is interesting that for all of the kind of oddity or convolutions of the plot, I do get the sense that this has been a pretty influential story or work on other mangaka.
Yeah, so we've been talking quite a bit about the plot or the premise of Sailor Moon, at least as laid out in these first two Eternal editions. Earlier I said that there were certain aspects of the story that I found maybe a tad problematic at times. Mm-hmm. I think one of those that I wanted to emphasize is Takeuchi's storytelling style through illustration. There are, and I don't know if you felt the same way, maybe I'm just not the same kind of visual reader that some people are, but at times I thought on some of the pages, especially when there was a lot of action going on, mm-hmm. I thought that visually things got a little too confusing. In other words, I wasn't exactly sure what was going on. I don't know if it was a function of too many action lines or the kind of paneling style Takeuchi has, or the way that she lays out things on a page, like the mise en page. But at times, I didn't know exactly what was going on. And at first, that bugged me. But then after I was getting into the first volume, I just decided, go with it. It'll make sense later. And that worked. Mm-hmm.
I think, I don't think I really thought too much about it as I was reading through it. But I can definitely see where you're talking about the way that certain action set pieces can kind of become difficult to parse. I do think that's there, though. Like you, I kind of, I think I was, adequately kind of enthralled or charmed by the narrative at that point, where it didn't. Like you, I might have had a difficult time sort of articulating what exactly was going on, but I don't think it detracted from my experience. It certainly didn't slow my reading down. And ultimately I was you're kind of able to figure out what was going on. Though I will agree that I think Takeuchi's aesthetic is not necessarily the best suited for complex action sequences, which is fine, and I think it's more than made up for in various ways, in elements that I think her aesthetic is much more suited to kind of express. You get these beautiful dramatic panels. I'm thinking of one where it's a kind of long panel, and it's Sailor Jupiter, I believe, kind of calling forth a lightning bolt, and it's a very simple image, but the kind of way she plays the white of the lightning bolt against the black of the sky, I think, is beautiful. Or these other scenes where you have Sailor Moon and Tuxedo Mask kind of looking longingly at one another, and Takeuchi draws the scene as this really lush and kind of sort of opaque kind of florid image that I think is really just lush and beautiful. And so I think the action sequences can become kind of convoluted, but then they're kind of balanced out by these other moments that are a little more kind of still, and that I think are just absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I still think that with some, not most or all, but with some of the action scenes, at least I, as a reader, wasn't sure exactly what was going on, or sometimes even who was saying what. But you're right. Many times this is balanced out aesthetically through these kind of pages and panel layouts that you were describing. And I absolutely appreciated some of those that you were describing, right? So you would have, I don't know, either maybe on the right or the left, kind of a long panel where you have a figure or the panel itself that just consumes the entire height of the page. Mm-hmm. And then you have to the side, either the right or the left, maybe smaller images that play off of or maybe lead into that one long panel on the page. And sometimes that long image overlaps other panels. And so it's almost as if you overlay one panel which is transparent over another. And so I really did appreciate that. Now, you were mentioning that in many ways for you as a reader, Sailor Moon is a product of its time, say the 1990s. And I mean, I agree. There's something about Sailor Moon that definitely does scream manga. One of the things that we pointed out in our first couple of episodes years ago on the manga series was that manga is not so much a style, right? That because a lot of people, I think of manga in that way, that there is a manga style, but as we have shown time and time again by the choices that we've made of books to read, there's not one manga style. So, for instance, this, Takeuchi's illustrative style is vastly, vastly different from Inio Asano or Naoki Urasawa. I mean, very different. And in fact, you could argue that someone like Urasawa seems to be much more Western than what you would consider manga. And in fact, if someone didn't know that Urasawa wrote, let's say, Master Keaton, and they read Master Keaton, I think that reader could come away thinking, okay, this was a Western artist who created this. Because the way that not only Keaton, but also all of the other characters are created or drawn in Master Keaton, you could say the same with Monster and 20th Century Boys. There's really nothing not much, let's say. I don't want to say nothing, but there's not much of what most people would consider, let's say, visually typical of manga, or even particularly Asian, because even his Asian characters don't necessarily look Japanese. And like Keaton himself, who is, not entirely Japanese, but he's part Japanese. But I would say that Takeuchi's style does epitomize what most people would probably think of as a manga style, mistakenly so, because you have the really large moe eyes. You have the beautiful, not only face, but also the shape of the body and the chin that comes down to a point. And you have that with both the men and the women. And I think in terms of especially the facial visuals and the long flowing hair with the women, a lot of people would say, oh, well, that's typical manga. It's not typical manga, but I think that Takeuchi's style betrays what many people think of incorrectly as a manga style. Yeah,
I think you used the word, you said it kind of epitomizes a certain kind of, or certain conception of what manga looks like. And I think that's right, though I don't know if I would use the word epitomize, because I think that Sailor Moon, or a series like Sailor Moon, is largely responsible for creating that conception, right? The popularization or the popularity of the series is one of the things that contributed to that conception. So it's not simply that it is kind of a solid example of this style, but that it's the thing. It's kind of the text that created that. Though I think actually reading Sailor Moon, it becomes pretty apparent that the kind of simple, cheap, amateurish style that people who are kind of unfamiliar with manga, that kind of aesthetic that they think is indicative or exemplary of manga. I think reading Sailor Moon, it's clear that anyone who draws in a kind of cheap imitation of that style, or who produces that let's call it a capital M manga style, are they're not attending to the fact that I think Takeuchi is an incredibly accomplished artist. I mean, obviously, like the kind of the faces she draws, like you mentioned, are highly stylized. They're pretty cartoony. You have the big eyes, the simple facial features, the angular, oversized head. That's all pretty evident. But if you look at the details of everything else she draws, it's really ornate. It's really elaborate. It's really finely detailed. I think she does an excellent job drawing people. Right. It's clear that she is a talented and competent artist and illustrator, and that the kind of simplistic or simplified way of drawing faces is a choice, and And I think those are the elements that people tend to associate with when they think of manga as a style. But actually reading the book firsthand, it's clear that there's so much more going on in even the things that are being kind of cherry picked to maybe produce those quote unquote manga style, or that manga style. I think this is just a long-winded way of me saying that I was really kind of bowled over by Takeuchi's art. I thought it was extraordinary. There's some panels where her inking of hair is just really, really impressive, and just really catches the eye in an unusual way. How did you have a similar experience, or kind of what was your? We've spent a lot of time, like you said, talking about the kind of narrative of this, but what was your kind of take on the details of the art?
Oh yeah, I'm with you. Takeuchi's art is highly impressive, and I was highly impressed with the visuals, and not just the detail in many of the character illustrations. You mentioned the hair as an example, but what I've already referenced, the panel layout, the way that the page is composed. So it's not just the illustration style, but the composition as well. And I was quite taken by that. I still think that maybe during some of the action scenes, things can get a little confusing at times, but it plays itself out and explains itself, in the pages that follow in one form or another. So I really enjoyed that. By the way, I did look up on Amazon. I'm looking at this now. I don't know if it's a new translation, but it says newly revised translation. So maybe these were the original translators, but then they went back and, I don't know, fixed things that they thought needed to be fixed. Who knows?
Yeah.
But so there you go. There's the answer to that question. Now let me ask you something that we almost always ask each other when we're looking at series. One shots, that's different. Will you go on to continue reading Sailor Moon as future Eternal editions come out?
I probably will. I mean, I say that frequently on here, and I get sidetracked having to spend 3 months reading like Russian philosophers for work, and I don't do a very good job of actually keeping up with these series. But I would. I would like to continue reading the series. I was absolutely charmed by these first two, the first two of the volumes of these new editions, and I just thought it was a kind of fun, really charming, really endearing series. It's not something I think I want to read. I don't want to read one of those like Lone Wolf and Cub omnibuses that are like a cube of comics. I don't know if I want to read like one of those sized editions of the series in like one sitting. That might be a little too much, but it is something that I really fell in love with the art. I found the narrative and the series and the writing really charming and endearing, and just I thought it was just kind of fun to follow these characters along, and like I said, the art certainly didn't hurt either. So I think I'd be pretty keen to keep following these series and see how these trifurcations of identity play out.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, I'd like to go on to read them as well. With me, it's more of a function of time. Do I have the time to do this? But I do have the interest in going on and reading beyond this second volume in the Eternal editions. And for the reasons that you mentioned. And by the way, I think that the word charming is probably one of the most appropriate when it comes to the reading experience of Sailor Moon. That makes sense to me. Now, Kodansha is coming out with these Eternal editions at a pretty nice trot. As I mentioned earlier, the first volume of the Eternal edition came out in early September 11th, or at least in bookstores. Who knows? It may have been in comic shops earlier. The second volume, November 13th. And I don't know how many volumes in total there will be, but 5 are listed on Amazon. So number 3 is going to be coming out toward the end of January 29th. 4 is coming out on April 30th, according to Amazon. And then Volume 5 of the Eternal Edition is coming out on July 2nd. So by about a little more than the middle of next year, the 5, it could be 5 is all that they're doing. I don't know. But there's no more information beyond Volume 5 on Amazon that is going on here. And I don't know, because there were, I think in the original series, 18 volumes. And this originally ran from December of 1991 to February of 1997. So who knows? Maybe everything is contained in those 5 volumes. I don't know. But I would, to get to your question, I would like to go on to finish up Sailor Moon if I have the time. Well, let's move on to the second title that we're going to be discussing today. And I don't know if I would say that this is quite different from Sailor Moon, because I think that there are a lot of similarities. I'd like for us to discuss that possibility. But it's, I think in general, quite a different kind of narrative. And this is Mob Psycho 100, Volume 1. This is being put out by Dark Horse, and it's by One. And One is also the creator of One-Punch Man, which we discussed a few years back. What is One's real name? I know that is not...
it's definitely a pseudonym.
Yeah, it's a pseudonym. But do you know what the real name is?
I have no idea. I'm looking, I'm looking at Wikipedia right now, and there's not a... it just says it's a pseudonym. So I have absolutely no clue. Though I do get the sense that it's not as though it's it's like the episode of Justice League where Lex Luthor takes over the Flash's body and he like pulls the mask off and he is like, I don't know who this person is. Like, this is useless information. I get the sense that if we did know who One was, it's not as though it would be like a revelatory thing. It would be meaningful to us. He's a pretty interesting cartoonist, I think.
Now, did you go on beyond our first, I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 volumes that we discussed of One Punch Man, and continue reading on One Punch Man?
I read a couple volumes past the. I think we just looked at the first 2 or first couple. I read a few volumes past that, but not too many. And it's been a while since I've picked it up, so I'm quite a bit behind on that series. Though I did watch the anime, so. I know I have a certain sense of where the story goes beyond where we went. What about you? Did you keep up with that series at all after we?
I think I read one more volume, but I have gotten subsequent volumes, not all of them, with plans on reading them. And again, it's a matter of time. It's finding the time to do that. But I mean, I liked One Punch Man well enough. I can't remember exactly what I said about it. But it's interesting in that reading this first volume of Mob Psycho 100, I got the sense that I felt about this title what I was feeling about, let's say, the first couple of volumes, 2 or 3 volumes of One Punch Man when we discussed it on the show.
So what, I guess that's a good opening for me to ask. How did you feel reading this volume?
I thought it was intriguing, and I thought it had a lot of possibility. Ultimately, I enjoyed it, but there were parts of it that I didn't enjoy as much, and I thought that the narrative was getting rather bogged down. So maybe this would be a good way of introducing at least parts of the premise, because at the beginning of the story, we're introduced to a guy by the name of Arataka Reigen. I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name, Reigen. Right?
Yeah, that's how I was pronouncing it. So,
and he is, and I can't remember what he calls himself, but he is supposed to be able to communicate and even help people get rid of demons and spirits and evil forces that haunt them. Okay. The problem with him is that he really doesn't have the power that he think he has. And it becomes quite comedic. I like that part of the story because this guy becomes, I don't know if I'd call it comic relief necessarily, but he becomes a nexus of comedy at times. Now I'm
trying to think of like what a good analog would be. I feel like I've seen this character type before. He's a sort of, for readers who aren't familiar with the kind of series, he's at once a kind of sincere figure in that he does seem to kind of genuinely care about Mob, the main character, who's a sort of protege. But then at the same time, like you said, he's a kind of fraud or con man who is in a way trying to exploit Mob. So he's got this interesting relationship where he's on the one hand concerned about the well-being of this person, and then also like constantly trying to kind of use this person's ability to his advantage. I'm trying to think if I feel as though this is a kind of archetype that readers have seen before. Yeah,
I think you're right. I can't think of an analog as well. But now you mentioned his protege, Mob. Now this is a young boy. I can't remember. How old is he?
He's
in high school?
Yeah, he's definitely in high school. I feel like 14. He's an 8th grader.
Okay. And his name is Shigeo Kageyama, but he goes by the name of Mob. And it's never explained why he goes by the name Mob. But, excuse me, the thing about Mob is he actually does have the powers that Reigen claims that he has, but doesn't. And Mob understands this, but puts up with Reigen. In fact, I think even Mob believes that there's something to Reigen, that he is his mentor, that he can help Mob, but Mob's the one with the power. Mob's the one who, so to speak, does all the heavy lifting when it comes to these evil spirits. So, I like that premise, and I really appreciated that relationship. And I thought that what we have with, Reigen being, sincere, but nonetheless a bit of a con man, or at least he deludes himself into thinking that he has certain powers, and his relationship with Mob, who is much more modest, but does have the powers. I mean, I think that there's a lot of potential there. The thing that got me about this first volume of Mob Psycho 100, I mentioned the phrase bogged down. I liked the first part of this first volume, but then when we're introduced to Lord Dimple, I think that's where there are parts of the story with Lord Dimple that are fine and are really good, but at times I got the feeling, okay, let's move on. There are other spirits. There's other evil that could be explored. Basically, at one point in the story, and this is, I think, before we get halfway through, Mob is outside and he's just standing, and I can't remember if it's 1 or 2 women come by and they ask him, is he okay? He doesn't look that happy. And of course, they're smiling. And so they take him back to a meeting that they're going to. And at this meeting, everybody is smiling. Everybody is happy. And it gets to the point that it just is creepy. You don't know why these people are happy and smiling all the time. And everything is sunshine, hunky-dory, and all of that. The leader of this group goes by the name of Lord Dimple. And Dimple, again, like the rest of his congregation, smiles and everything's happy, and everybody should be happy. Then we start to get the sense that there's something weird, otherworldly, potentially evil about Lord Dimple, and that there's some brainwashing going on. And so they attempt to, and the thing about Mob is that he never smiles. He always has a serious look on his face. And in fact, if you look at the cover of this first volume of Mob Psycho 100, that's basically how Mob looks all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so he never smiles. And so Lord Dimple and the others try to get him to smile through various means, and they don't, and they're frustrated. They're trying to turn him. Lord Dimple eventually realizes that Mob has certain powers that even he can't crack. Lord Dimple couldn't crack. I'm okay with parts of the saga, as I'll call it, with Lord Dimple and his disciples. But one spends so much time on this storyline in this first volume that I just was getting tired of it after a while.
Mm-hmm. I am curious, how did you read the book as like in one sitting, or I mean, I am just curious what the kind of manner in which you kind of read the book was. Well, did you kind of like space it out over several readings, or was it more kind of a single reading?
No, I didn't read it in one day. I think I may have read it over 2 days. But so it's not in just one sitting, but I did read it in a relatively compact period of time.
Yeah. No, because I mean, listening to you just describe the ways in which that the kind of hint of a longer story arc seems to be a kind of change of pace almost, and it does seem to slow down a little bit. I can see what you're talking about, and I read it in a similar way. I didn't read it in one sitting, but I certainly didn't read it in the way in which it was originally published, which is I can't tell if it was published weekly or monthly, but it was published in like a regular web publication. So I am curious if maybe our reading experiences of it might have been different if we had read it, with longer or larger gaps between, chapters. Maybe the slower pace of some of those chapters that emphasize the story with Lord Dimple. Maybe we wouldn't quite have felt so bogged down as you said if we had read it more kind of piecemeal over the course of 8 weeks or whatever, or 8 months or however, whatever intervals this was coming out at.
So you had similar feelings with the Lord Dimple story?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would have quite put them in the terms that you did, but yeah, reading it, I certainly did feel less compelled by those chapters than maybe some of those earlier ones, or even some of the scenes within those chapters that had nothing or little to do with the character. I definitely felt like they had a little bit more of a kind of active, sort of propulsive energy to them that made reading them pretty compulsive. Though, like I said, so yeah, I think it sounds like we had very similar experiences reading those. Though, like I said, I think I having heard you kind of detail your experience, I would agree with it. Though I wouldn't have put it in quite those terms before you did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're onto something in terms of the serialization and consumption of Mob Psycho 100. Because if I had read this in serial form, so for instance, I think it says, and I'm looking at the Wikipedia page, but it would come out originally, and this was a 16-volume series that ran from April of 2012 to December of 2017. So it's not really that old, but it was originally serialized in Yura Sunday magazine. Mm-hmm. So if I had, let's say, an English version of Yura Sunday, then reading it bit by bit by bit, I think would have been a much different reading experience than what you and I did, which was reading it over a relatively compressed period of time and getting that, bogged down feeling, especially when it comes to the Lord Dimple part of the story. It would be different. But again, I think that it's an intriguing premise. I come back to this relationship between Reigen and Mob, and both the drama and comedy embedded at least potentially, in that relationship. And I think that that's where much of the promise in this series rests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think the series is, on the one hand, I do enjoy reading it because I do think that for all the shit that one gets for for his work as an artist, I think some of the art in the series is really compelling, which we can talk about here in a second. But I do think that, like you, a lot of the I had a sort of fun time largely reading the book, and I think it was largely down to, like you said, this relationship between Reagan and Mob, this weird sort of mentor-mentee relationship that's sort of there's a what might be a good way to describe the nature of that relationship. There's a sort of it has a similar feel as the relationship between Charlie Chaplin and Jackie Coogan in The Kid. Okay. It's a kind of relationship in which one is supposed to be an authority figure who is teaching the other about the world, but in actual fact, he's a kind of screw up who doesn't really know what he's doing. He's kind of faking his way through every situation, and he's kind of scamming himself into a position of authority for this younger, impressionable person. And so there's a kind of slapstick quality to the nature of that relationship that I think is really effectively funny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's an interesting comparison. Charlie Chaplin and the Coogan character. Huh. Okay. Okay. Now you were talking about one's art and him getting hell from some readers about that. I don't know about that. I mean, has he gotten criticized frequently about his art style?
Yeah, so my understanding of one's reputation is that it's largely built on his work as a writer, particularly his work as a writer on One-Punch Man. That's been the kind of breakout popular series of his, and it actually started as a web comic where he would write and draw it, similar to Mob Psycho 100. And Yusuke Murata, the artist on this like new series of One-Punch Man, just kind of approached one and decided and asked him if he could redraw the series, and then it got picked up for broader distribution, and that's the kind of version of the series that we've read, and that sort of helped him build his reputation as a writer. But as you can kind of see from Mob Psycho 100, he has a sort of simplistic style. I would compare it, with a couple exceptions, it's very frequently similar to what I've seen of Go Nagai's work on Devilman, even some of the work that we saw when we looked at Go Nagai's Cutie Honey a couple months ago. It's very flat, it's very angular, it's very simplistic. It draws a lot on it's the ink to kind of designate pretty simple shapes and forms and environments and things like that. And, the renderings of people are again, pretty simple, pretty flat. And you can kind of see that throughout the series. And I think a kind of quick look at any page will see, a listener will be able to tell what I'm talking about. And so my understanding is that because of that, he's kind of got a reputation as not really an accomplished artist, as someone whose real strength is in the writing, and their work as an artist is just a kind of way of supplementing their writing, of getting their writing out there. It's not really what he excels at. But reading this, I if you actually take the time to read Mob Psycho 100 and pay attention to the things he's doing with not just the compositions and illustrations of individual panels or pages, but the kind of way he's using the way he's paneling pages, the way he's composing and laying out pages. It's clear that maybe one doesn't have he's not the kind of draftsman that someone like an Alex Ross might be. You know, he's not going to give us these incredibly lush, hyper detailed, photorealistic images, but he's clearly someone with an incredibly strong sense of how to lay out a page, of how to make a comic function and read well and flow. And he's clearly someone who's capable of I'm thinking of there. There's one page in particular, the scene with, it's actually a scene from his first encounter with Lord Thimble, who we've mentioned, where he has to. It's the game he plays where he has to hold the milk in his mouth and not laugh. And there's that page where he kind of spits out the milk, and it's like bubbles, and it really does look like something drawn by like late period Frank Miller. It's like it's this huge kind of figure of black, and his like the white of his eyes and the white of the like bubbles of the milk coming out of his mouth are so strikingly contrasted against that black. It's just a really beautiful image, right? And so he's someone who's clearly capable of, when kind of when the scene calls for it, of drawing really beautiful pages. And so to answer your question, my kind of limited understanding of one is that he is his art is something that his readers tolerate because they enjoy his writing. But I don't actually reading something he's drawn, it just doesn't compute, because it is, this is I think a really well drawn comic. Mm-hmm.
Earlier when we were discussing Sailor Moon, we were talking about Takeuchi's style and how, there's not one, as we said many times before, there's not one manga style. And I think it's interesting to contrast one's illustrative efforts to Takeuchi's, because, as we mentioned, whereas Takeuchi, someone, let's say the common reader would look at Takeuchi and says, yeah, that's manga. They look at one and they may be unsure at first because, as you point out, there's something rather flat, two-dimensional about one's art. And at times it's not beautiful like Takeuchi's, I'd say. Okay, I wouldn't use the word beautiful for it. It's a very different kind of illustrative style. The characters at times look cartoony. At times there's more detail. More often than not, though, there's not that kind of detail that we were discussing in terms of Takeuchi, right? But that's okay. I mean, I'm fine with one's art style. I have no problem with it at all. But there is a kind of simplicity, flatness to it that you don't find in a lot of manga.
I think I do think it is a kind of aesthetic that, like I said, it is a sort of throwback to the I hate to use the word simple, because I think that expresses a kind of, as though I don't think there's something accomplished about that aesthetic, but it does the more simplified aesthetic of someone like Go Nagai, right? And so in a certain sense, one is kind of employing certain and I don't want to make any claims that he's somehow emulating or trying to consciously do this thing that someone like Go Nagai is doing, but it does evoke, it does recall older ways of drawing manga. But then at the same time, and I think even just the cover of this first edition is a good example of it, right? Because then you have the very, very simple figure of Mob, but then he's surrounded by these very finely detailed sort of crumbling buildings and stuff like that. It's not quite as detailed as someone like Katsuhiro Otomo, but it's sort of approaching that level of kind of tedious precision. And I think, and so I think ultimately the result of kind of combining those, of moving from one to the other, as well as combining them in single images, as though they're kind of two layers or two distinct planes of reality that are kind of superimposed upon one another creates a really unusual, really interesting aesthetic where it's clear that it's being drawn by someone who's capable of these kind of finer details, but is making a choice to employ an older kind of nostalgic style of rendering most of the series, and it's a really interesting book to look at for that reason, I think, because it's so distinct from I think a lot of other not just contemporary manga, but distinct from manga generally that I've encountered.
Yeah, I agree. And, when I used the word simple a little while ago, I didn't mean that in a negative way, but I think simplified is a better way of putting it, as you said. Now, is this a series that you think that you're going to go on to continue reading?
Yeah, like you said, and like we kind of talked about, I do think, I tend to think of this series as a comedy, and what I've seen of the anime really plays up those comedic elements, and I do think, like we talked about, I do think it's successfully funny, and I think it's fun to read. I think it's humorous, and so I think it's on one level I would like to continue reading it because I do find it kind of charming and endearing and enjoyable in that way, but. Like I also mentioned, I do want to continue to see one draw these. It might be useful to think of these scenes as kind of punctuation, right? You have these sequences that are drawn in this more simplified manner, and they kind of accumulate or culminate, I should say, in these really elaborately composed, elaborately drawn, really wonderfully illustrated images. And so even if I didn't think it was funny or successful in that way, I would continue reading it simply because I really do want to see more of one's drawing. What about you?
I might, and again, it's a function of time. It always comes down to time.
Yeah, absolutely.
In fact, I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent here, but one of the things that I have found over the past, I was about to say year, but I'd say it's longer than that, is almost all of the reading that I do now is for the podcast. Not all, but almost all. And I guess that's because I serve as a co-host to about everything we do except for the Young Reader series. So after finishing with manga, then I have to catch up on European comics in translation so I can record with Pascal, which we're going to do this weekend. And then right after that, I have to prepare for the regular review show for next week, which Sturge and I do. And it goes on and on and on and on. There are web comics as well. And then there are other things that I really would like to read and digest before the end of the year. Because, to be quite timely, at the very end of December, our very last episode is when now Sturge being the co-host, the regular co-host, and I will talk about our favorites from the past year, 2018. There's a lot that I haven't read, of course, and I'd like to read some of the things that we didn't review on the show. I'd also like to be able to have the time or to find the time to read more prose. I've been planning for quite a while to go back and reread a lot of Mark Twain and even read for the first time, like Following the Equator, certain Twain narratives and texts that I haven't read yet, histories and biographies. I have a big list of non-comics or non-graphic novel readings. I just need to get to that. So coming back to this question, am I going to go on with Mob Psycho 100? I'd like to. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah. No, that's like I was trying to say when we were talking about this with Sailor Moon. Yes, it's we often come upon series that I would like to continue reading, but like you, I've got to go teach, and I've got to read things for my own classes, and it just not as much time as I would like to keep up with all of the wonderful manga that we've kind of discovered through the process of doing this show.
Exactly. So we looked at two series or beginnings of series that both of us, I think, would highly recommend to our listeners. We started off with Naoko Takeuchi's Sailor Moon Eternal Editions. The first two are already out. The third comes out in January, and this is being released by Kodansha. And then after that, we discussed the first volume, released through Dark Horse, of One's Mob Psycho 100, and that came out last month in November. Two fun titles for the quote-unquote November manga show. But we will, fret not, dear listener, we will be back later in December for the December manga episode. And if you want to find great deals on the kind of manga that Shea and I were discussing on this show, then you couldn't do better than going to the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and they will take care of all of your comics and, of course, manga pre-ordering needs. Great discounts. You can't beat them. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this month's or November's manga show. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Pick up your phone and dial 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And you can always email us. You can email the show at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can email me at Shea@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, why don't you tell the fine people what your email address is?
Understandably so, Derek@comicsalternative.com. We're all over social media, so you can contact us that way as well. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, on TuneIn, and on iHeartRadio. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. So there you go. Another manga show. We hope you enjoyed it. And remember, we will be back later in December for yet another manga show. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
Take care.